Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by AmWager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of AmWager. The platform is packed with features including live video, race replays, conditional wagering, and true odds, a predictive estimate of the off odds that will give you an edge. AmWager gives players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a win bet to a complex structured group of pick 5 tickets using the ABC strategy. With a rating of over 4.5 stars on Google, AmWager is a favorite among horse players. Sign up now at amwager.com to take advantage of the simplest sign-up bonus in the business, a 100% first deposit match up to $150. If you want to bet with the best, then you need an edge. You need AmWager.
Welcome to episode 35 of the Bet with the Best podcast. Joining us this time is Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge champion and author of the book, A Bettor Way of Thinking, Matt Miller, to talk about betting on the Breeders' Cup. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks a bunch, Chris. I was on, I think one of your first, I think it was show number 3, was beyond excited. And I think for this particular topic, you've got me just as excited as I was the first time. So thanks for having me back, and hopefully I can point some things out that are helpful.
Yeah, you are, I think, the first person I've had on for a second time on the Bet with the Best podcast. And you were one of the first people we talked to. We'll probably, some of the things we touched on in that first discussion, we'll come back to in here because some of that was about the Breeders' Cup and the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, which is really the focus of this. But I think we'll get into a little more detail than we did the first time around. But I certainly would encourage any of the listeners who enjoy this podcast, if you want to go back to, and all the podcasts are stored on your provider, and go back to episode 3 and listen in on the first discussion we had, because that was a lot of fun as well. All right, let's get started. Go ahead.
Right, go ahead. I was just going to say it was, and you do a nice job of organizing these shows. I think I told you before, as I sat down to write a book, I went back to the notes I had from the questions you had. And so you produce a lot of really good evergreen content. There's not a lot here that, just goes stale or whatnot. And, I don't know, after some amount of time, I could probably stand to listen to the same guy talk again. So it's not a bad idea.
Well, that was the goal, was to create a library that would be somewhat evergreen, and players could go back and listen, or, if they hear about the show now, they can go back and listen to all the past shows and hopefully get quite a bit out of those, and they are about pretty much timeless topics, although this game is constantly changing. And that's what we're going to talk about some, and how you deal with that. And I'm not going to have you do your horse player origin story. You covered that the first time through, so I'm not going to make you share that again. But if listeners want to hear that, they can go back to that first show. But I do want to talk some about your book, A Bettor Way of Thinking. That's spelled Bettor, a little punny title, which I always like puns. And you were kind enough to send me a copy of the book, and I've read it, and it's an excellent book, and I highly recommend it to the readers. But maybe kind of share, I'm sure you've had some other interviews about your book since it came out, just some of the, give readers a sense of, or the listeners a sense of what's in the book, and kind of highlight some of the key points. And I might follow up with some questions, because there were some parts of that I thought were really, really well discussed, and really important points that you raised in that book. So I'll let you kind of give your view of things, and if you don't cover what I'm interested in covering, I might probe you with a few questions. But why don't you kind of share the highlights of your book, or maybe talk a little bit about the book, whatever you want to share.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for the compliments. And that's, it's really nice. And honestly, that's part of the reason I did this. I left the corporate world. I don't know what it is now, a year and a half ago. I've always had a vision for myself one day of writing a book, and came up with the topic essentially of what book would I have loved to have read to help me 15 or 20 years ago as a bettor or as a horse player. And, my own game has evolved tremendously over time. I do not claim to have always been good at this. I don't even claim to be good at it regularly now. I think that's a pretty bold statement, but I'm certainly the best I've been as I've continued adapting and learned all kinds of lessons, many of which I had to physically pay for. And as I look at that, I say, wow, I've got the time to put these thoughts on paper and the inclination to help people out with what seems to be, at least in my opinion, the hardest part about this game, which is the betting. I know people love talking about the handicapping podcasts, lots of great ones, Sport of Kings, you name it, where really smart analytical people are picking horses and going through their handicapping process. I don't disrespect that in the least. Yeah, I clearly recognize it as a critical part of this game. And yet, as I look at my own play, it's not the part of the game I'm best at. I have buddies that are quite good at this, that if I'm just being honest, I don't think I would do as good a job at picking horses. Where I seem to have found my niche is on the betting side. It's extracting value. It's where someone else looks at a 2 to 5 shot and says, what am I supposed to do with this? And I'm licking my chops. Or someone else is looking at a tournament that seems to require an obscenely high total to win. And I'm looking at this as, easy, steps 1, 2, and 3. Part of this, so the word thinking is important. A lot of it does have to do with the way I think about these things. I found a way in this book to tie in some life lessons, some business lessons that all tie in these exact same concepts. And what I'm really trying to do with this book is show how a perspective of looking at the world through risk and reward. Annie Duke wrote a book called Thinking in Bets. It's about a mentality. And this book is something similar. It's designed to get people to think in terms of risk reward, what's worth it, what's not worth it. In the horse racing context, what are the risky spots that are appropriate for value? What are the risky spots that are best to avoid? Should I be looking for higher strike rate spots in certain contexts, like a tournament? All sorts of questions asked and answered like that. But it really goes through a process in the book of kind of talking about the issue in terms of life, and then flipping it to the gambling and betting side. And the feedback's been great. People have been very kind about saying, gosh, even Pete Fornatail, the editor, I know he's a biased source, but the first thing he said when he read this thing is, man, this would have been really helpful a bunch of years ago. I could have started implementing some of this stuff back then. And so, yeah, the good news is this is not only for the Breeders' Cup. It is not only for the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, the most expensive cash money live tournament out there. You can apply these very principles, scale them back. Actually, an awful lot of this book, I don't mean to put a bad look on anyone's face as I say this. I would actually say an awful lot of this book is about responsible gaming. It's about bankroll management. It's about, so Chris gives out a great pick on his podcast, and the person listening says, okay, I got it. I write it down. Now what do I do with that? And that's where I step in saying, well, this is what I do. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's the only way, but my process, as it's evolved in the last few years, has turned me very much from a losing to average player to something much better than that. And again, you read the book. Hopefully I'm not sure I'm expecting anybody to adopt the whole thing necessarily, but if there's just a handful of good nuggets people can take away, and that's on the cash betting side, that's on the tournament betting side. And obviously, as the Breeders' Cup approaches, it's the granddaddy of them all, and hence my level of excitement for talking about this stuff.
So that's a great kind of overview. So what I'm hoping you'll be willing to do is kind of share, what do you think are some of the main points that you hit on in the book, that
Sure.
are relevant to betting?
And it's funny, I can probably grab a copy to help me, because really looking at it chapter by chapter, it is broken down that simply. So there's a chapter, I actually think I talked about this on the last podcast, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but we talked about the concept of Rain Man and how he was a brilliant blackjack player, just unmatched in terms of skill level and memory and all that, and couldn't have been any more of a fool than the rest of us when playing Wheel of Fortune. And so the metaphor being, when are you playing blackjack and when are you playing Wheel of Fortune? And I personally have gotten very good at self-awareness and realizing what areas of betting or handicapping represent blackjack for me versus what represents Wheel of Fortune, where it's not as much of a skill for me. And again, I don't take anything away from other people. Look, in the game of Wheel of Fortune, you can't be good at that one. It's not possible. But there's plenty of things where I'm not as good at something as someone else. And so it's recognizing your weaknesses and plugging the holes. And that could be as a parent. That could be as a worker in an office where you're managing a team, but you're not great at some aspect of what the role entails. Or it could be part of your betting where, you're one of these, the millions of people across the country that sit there saying, I'm much better at handicapping than betting. I seem to pick all kinds of winners. I can't cash. My long shots are all buried in the middle of sequences that I'm not cashing on. Blah, blah, blah. And I'm here to say, pun intended, there is a better way. And I, with a fair amount of specificity, lay that out. Okay, so that's blackjack and, knowing your strengths and plugging your weaknesses. There's a chapter talking about knowing your opponent. And that is absolutely relevant and critical to what we're going to be talking about today. The Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, I am just brutally honest and transparent, and whatever word you want to put to it, about trying to explain in this book what this tournament is. And I don't think there's really a hint of negativity to me. I don't feel negativity, but at the same time, I look at this tournament and I don't think it quite is what everybody makes it out to be. You have so many people coming at it from so many different walks of life and with so many different purposes. And so it's funny, that word purpose goes to chapter 1 of my book, which, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? In the context of the BCBC, right? First of all, some people might be honest and they might say, I'm not even trying to win. I would actually applaud them for recognizing what their objective is before they, jump onto the field of battle and start playing. But I think the average person gives a somewhat thoughtless answer and just says, my goal is to go kill it. My goal is to win. It's to have the best day I've ever had. And when you say to them, how are you going to do that? They tend not to have much of a specific plan for exactly what they're going to do. And when you drill down into it even further, what do you think it's going to take to win this year? How hard have they thought about that? And have they factored this year's races into their number? I mean, I look at the year of Flightline winning. It was clear to everybody the total for that year's winning tournament is going to be higher because there's a raging free square on the end. So did people take that into account and adjust their targets? Do they have targets? Are they even thinking this way? Right. So a lot of the book goes into, this is what the tournament is. This is how it is set up. This is the myriad of ways that people get into it. And actually, I think there's a lot to that, because the mindset that one has when one plays can be very different if you won your way there versus if you paid your way there. I don't necessarily think your mindset should be different, but I think it just does. And I think there's a lot of people, and I'm not trying to make anybody shrivel in their chair or feel embarrassed, but I think there's a lot of people that if you ask them, do you have any business playing in a $10,000 entry tournament? They would say no, just like they would say, I don't have any business spending $25,000 on a front row Cubs World Series ticket. But yet somehow, if they are given that or win that, they may use that, right? So there were all sorts of people at that World Series that couldn't afford the tickets they were sitting in, the seats they were sitting in, and yet they were somehow able to justify to themselves that it was okay because they didn't pay for it, right? I would look at them and say, those things are as good as cash, and you did spend the money. Sorry to ruin your fun. I hope it was fun, and it was a memory of a lifetime potentially, but don't fool yourself. And it's the same thing with the Breeders' Cup. You win a $10,000 entry to this thing, you don't have to play. And if that water is too deep for you, and if these dollars are too meaningful relative to what you make in a year or what your net worth is or what your projected expenses are over the coming months or years, you don't have to play. It's exciting. It's amazing you won your way in. 10 grand's a ton of money. It's amongst the most valuable prizes offered in tournaments besides cash. And yet I'd say, look, it's a lot of money, and you're playing against some people that don't treat it the same way you do, right? I'll get into this later, but for me, this is a game. It's an entry fee to a game. And once playing the game, I'm playing a game. I'm not looking at this as, you can stop any time. I use the analogy, living in Chicago, you can take the express lanes downtown if that's your objective, or you can take the locals. And if your objective is to get downtown, I don't see the point of getting most of the way there and then bailing and taking one of these exits. Some people, once they hit balances that are much higher than normal, because again, I don't think most people are playing at this dollar level, some people just very naturally, emotions take over and they say, I got to get the heck off this highway. I'm sitting here with way too much money in the car. I don't fault them for that. I applaud them for being responsible. I do question a little bit, were you in the right tournament in the first place if you were going to be someone that bailed once things started going well? You did pay $2,500 to be in this tournament, and if you're not going to give yourself much of a shot to win, you could probably just be betting cash instead and not having wasted the $2,500 entry fee. So I do look at people, I don't worry about the guy that's buying in. I mean, people joke about, what it takes to qualify for this thing. You need to be dumb enough to put in $10,000 of cash and think you're going to get that back. And if that's too ridiculous for you, having a goal of winning a seat is terrific. But again, recognize where you are once you've won your seat. And if you can't get your mind around the idea that you're playing a game, you are playing at a material disadvantage relative to other players that would do anything in the context of the game to advance. And so, okay, tying it back to the book. Well, I'm going to pause there. Tell me if you have questions.
Well, so I just want to sort of summarize, I think, some of the key points you made. First of all, you started out with the Blackjack versus Wheel of Fortune, and that was sort of play to your strengths. And I think you didn't really go into detail, but it sounded like, and if you have weaknesses, if you can't avoid them, maybe you need to partner with somebody or expand your team to help plug your weaknesses. I mean, so
listen to Bet with the Best. Yeah, go buy Matt Miller's book. Go sit next to someone who's really good with numbers, if that's your issue, right? Just if your attention strays, sit next to someone and tell them, I need you to elbow me in the ribs all day long asking me if I've bet all my minimums. Right? If you know that you get flighty and you don't pay attention to the rules of the tournament while you're in the middle of it, just have someone ask you, did you do your minimums? If that's your weakness, plug it. I mean, that's really the idea here. And I do think a lot of people, I don't really understand it, that there's some sort of horse player honor, the honor of saying how good a handicapper one is, and then joking about how bad a bettor one is. And they somehow think that that makes them look cool or like they're part of the club. And no, I don't want to be bad at any of it. And if I am, I'm going to surround myself with someone who's better. And I'm actually going to listen to them. It's a little hard to do at times. And look, I do handicap all these races myself, and I then do go listen to a handful of podcasts who I've plugged enough times here that I won't keep doing it obnoxiously. And I will factor those other opinions into my opinions. I mean, that's my process. There are others that would say, oh my gosh, the minute I listen to somebody else, everything falls apart and I need to just follow what I think for myself, but I bet poorly. Well, okay, go buy this book, go listen to this podcast, go look at prior results from tournaments. These are fixable things, right? And I'm also not joking. Call me. The number of readers that I've gotten on the phone with who have said, can we just talk for a little bit? I want to understand this a little bit better about how you're using your two entries for this. Chris, I love talking about this stuff, and I find myself talking to strangers that are not strangers anymore, making some nice friends, and I'm getting all sorts of cool responses from people that they've won their first tournament since reading this thing. So there's a lot more to these tournaments than just picking winners and having, nailing exactas and whatnot. And I think that's probably the most valuable thing that I can pass along as we talk about that in the context of the BCBC. It's, these are kind of separate disciplines, and having your picks, I would say to anybody, go through your process, have your picks more, and we're going to get to topics like this later, but more so than ever, rank those picks, rank them. They are not all weighted the same. They can't be. These races are impossible. So some of them frustrate us to the point of throwing our pens down or coming back 20 minutes later and trying again. It's as good a spot to cover the issue as any, I suppose. You don't have to play every race. And if you find yourself confounded by one, I wouldn't take that as some amazing challenge to make that the one I focus on. Just skip it and go find a more reliable spot, whether that's a favorite that you think is more likely to win or a long shot that you think has a great value opportunity relative to its odds. But a lot of this has to do not just with forming your opinions, but ranking them. Because when it comes to playing in this tournament, and again, I will let you control this interview in terms of minimums and structure and all that. But when it comes to playing this tournament, you can't play every race, and you kind of have to have somewhat of a plan with the ability to adapt it. But what you're going to do going in, it's otherwise a bit overwhelming as you get there to see, hundreds of the best horses in the world knocking heads with each other and trying to make sense of it.
Well, what you just described, and you were sort of focused more on the context of a contest, but I think pretty much everything you just said you could apply to everyday betting. And you don't have to bet every race. Not every opinion in every race is the same. I mean, everything you said, I would think you could generalize to betting. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Totally agree. I just think in the tournament context, strike rate becomes more important. When you're betting in cash, you can calibrate the types of bets you make for your own betting personality. But when you get to the BCBC, it's one chance a year. The most simple example I can give it's really incredible when you think about this. There's 450 something entries or whatever it is. And in a typical year, we don't need to make an argument of it. Let's just say the typical winning total, let's call it 150 grand and just round way up. So it's 20 times your money. You start with $7,500. There could be somebody out there that in the first race finds a 25-1 shot that they think looks amazing. Right? And there are 25-1 shots all day long that are amazing, actually. How many people just put the 7,500 to win on the one long shot and say, I'm going to win this whole tournament right now? Right? In my opinion, the horse is 25-1. Let's just say in actuality, the horse's true chances are 25-1. So let's say that's actual odds and actual value. Well, I would look at the average person in this tournament, 455 people, and I'd ask, do you think you have a better than 1 in 25 chance of winning? I think there's only a handful of pompous people like me that might say yes to that. I think the average person would say, realistically, no. Better than 1 in 25? Well, right. And then I guess I would ask them, so why aren't you betting all in on your 25-1 long shot that you love in the second race? Because that's your best chance to win by a mile based on your betting mentality. And yet some people just can't do it. They just can't. They don't bet $7,500 on 25-1 shots. Well, these are the signs that you're in a place that you don't belong. If these sorts of legal game moves sound outrageous, or, I guess I would look back at the person and say, okay, why don't you tell me your lower risk approach to getting to 150 grand than what I just outlined on the pick that you love? So you tell me what you're going to do instead. And invariably the person's going to start with, well, I'll probably have a $600 minimum on that one. And right, I mean, you and I both know you've blown your contest. I mean, if you really have that strong an opinion on that big a long shot, you've got to smash it. You've got to hit your opinions. That's what this tournament is. The problem with it, and what I struggle with this as well, you get one a year like this. And no offense to Jim Goodman and the Grade 1 Gamble and all the other terrific tournaments, there's only one like this. One. And take the Hamilton line. How are you going to use your shot? Are you going to take your shot on a 25-1 shot? Or are you going to take your shot trying to surgically pick apart every single race? Are you going to take your shot by betting $600 minimums, hoping to catch lightning in a bottle? Or are you going to take your shot with what I outline as a methodical approach, goal-based, looking at prior results from tournaments, identifying the total that you need to get your desired result, and working backwards from there, saying, okay, if I need 150 grand in this tournament, and if the horse I like in the last race is 4-1, why did I just pick a number where I have to do bad math? Whatever, I should have probably picked a different number. But the bottom line is you can quickly work backwards to figure out, okay, I only need 35 grand for the last race, given that it's still not too high, but whatever. I only need 35-1 for the last, I only need 35,000 for the last race to be able to bet what I want to get to my desired total. And okay, you kind of look at that $35,000, I don't know if you call it a milestone or whatnot, but you've kind of set up some interim markers for yourself. And you work backwards from there and say, okay, I need to get my $7,500 up to 35,000 so I can bet it on the horse I want to bet on the end. How do I do that? Look, one thing I'd suggest to people is put your thumb over the zeros. If it's one more zero than you're used to seeing, or even worse, two more zeros, don't look at them. This is units. And again, we're playing a game. When you're playing Monopoly, no part of you is looking at the price of a hotel and actually asking, like, if in reality that's a good price. I mean, that's a preposterous. You would never intermingle the two. I mean, one is a game and one is real life, and yet in the context of the BCBC, I think the dollars get people to a place of discomfort quickly enough that they allow themselves to think about too much extraneous stuff. Just focus on playing the game. Drew Coatney bet 97 grand to win on Flightline. And if that horse had stumbled out of the gate and lost, I don't know, I would have went home and said, Drew lost his $10,000 entry. He didn't lose 97 grand. He was in the middle of a game. He was heading downtown and he ran out of gas. And so it is such an advantage to a player who can play like this. To make yourself absolutely crazy about every dollar and to think about how hard this activity is on a daily basis, I think you're gonna get to the BCBC. And look, I think probably every player in it made the same mistake the first time. If you were lucky enough to hit something for a huge number, right? I'll pick on my buddy Howard Kravitz, who hit Love's Only You. He hit a huge, terrific double for something like 25 grand, and it soared him all the way up to like 13th on the leaderboard for where we were at the time. And I'm not trying to rip out a good buddy, but he looks at me with such excitement. It was the best hit of his life. And he says, awesome, now I get to go home with 10 grand no matter what. And I looked at him and said, we'll come back to this moment, but this is actually the moment you just lost the tournament. I don't know if you realize that, but you can't be on the field of battle sending home what you perceive to be extra ammunition. That's not possible. And if your mind goes there immediately, which it does for most people, at least the first time, it's a real good indicator you're in over your head. If you're immediately trying to put money in your pocket, if you're immediately, not focused on winning anymore the minute you hit something, and instead it's just, I want to make sure I'm maintaining a good day. These are all really suboptimal tournament behaviors, in my opinion, not just the BCBC, but the BCBC brings this out more than anything. It's the high dollar tournament. And so part of what I love talking about in this book is take these identical strategies, target setting, working your way backwards, spot picking, finding high strike rate horses. These all work for the $300 a week Naira Bets tournament, for the $500 NHC qualifiers through ExpressBet, through, right, there's smaller tournaments. Actually, there's a whole bunch more than I knew were there on Twin Spires. And so for the smaller tournaments, these strategies all work the same. They're much more comfortable. Right? You're just not dealing with these huge dollars where you've got stuff in the back of your head like, is my wife going to kill me if she finds out that I got up to 26 grand and blew it all? Right? That's a natural thought that most people have in this tournament. You shouldn't have to think that way. I mean, honestly, take this as a quick pointer. You should tell your wife in advance that might happen so that she doesn't get mad when you lose. Otherwise, she's going to say, why didn't you just get off the highway when you could have? And now you got to explain to someone not in the tournament, no, that doesn't make any sense. I'm wasting my $2,500. I had a goal. Right. Work these things out in advance so that you aren't in the heat of the moment. You're not dealing with stuff like your wife. So, these things that have nothing to do with proper strategy and proper play, but you never thought you'd get there. So, maybe I could reorganize some of these thoughts into something on preparation, but the mental preparation associated with this is just absolutely critical so that you kind of know how you're going to react. You're prepared. Hopefully you do hit something and you're ready to react. I'll keep going and say there's also a lot here that there's a big mental component. There's people that don't feel that this is for them. They feel, oh, I'm never going to win one of these things. That's not me. And they're almost putting up an obstacle to themselves by questioning whether they're meant for this. And, I try very hard in this book to give a pep talk saying no one is standing there that's going to give you permission. You just got to take it. You have to do what you think is right, and you have to act with conviction. But no one is going to tell you, oh, Chris, I know that's a really hard bet to make on the end, but this is your path, and this is good for you to do, and good choice. Like you're not going to get that kind of affirmation. You're not going to get someone telling you, I think you set your target too high or too low. This all comes from within. And anything you can do in advance to prepare yourself for knowing how you're going to act or react is just incredibly helpful. And so this isn't just a silly book plug. Read this book before the BCBC, right? Whether you've played in it before or not. I do think there's a lot here just in terms of preparation, in terms of one's mental readiness to do what you have to do. And we can get into specific strategies as you want. We talk about 2 entries or how to play the minimums, but just on a higher level, preparation, knowing what you're doing, understanding your opponent, understanding that these things look so similar year after year. The leaderboards, it's not just the names, it's also the dollars. These things, if you held them up and held them up to the sun, they would all look, they were printed on the same pieces of paper for the most part. The numbers don't change that much. There will come a year where some complete lunatic hits something gigantic and we see a total that we've never seen. But I'm not playing for those aberrational years. If I set a target for myself this year of 130 grand and going into the last race, the leader has 60 grand and I nail 130 grand and somebody beats me, hey man, nice job. Maybe I'm questioning my target, maybe I'm questioning, but this has so much to do with preparation and execution and just following a plan. And I don't mean to make it sound too nerdy. I have a terrific time in doing all of this. You're not going to find me these days with my nose buried in the program. I know what I'm doing. I'd say maybe one of the bigger pivots I've had to make in recent years was when I woke up and found out Jack Christopher was scratched. Okay, so lucky for me, I pivoted and came up with Corniche. That was a good one. But otherwise, there aren't many during the day, during the course of the weekend, where you're changing your mind or first forming an opinion. We get inundated with podcasts, with information. I think most of us go into these weekends knowing who we like. The question is whether you've translated that into knowing what your strategy is going to be for capitalizing on those opinions. And again, that's where this book comes in, at least in the tournament portions, to talk about how to gather your thoughts to do that.
So, you've kind of hit home on the point that if you want to play in these live bankroll contests, you sort of need to treat the money like Monopoly money. You pay your entry fee and then you play the game, and you're just keeping score to see who wins, and the target is to win and hit the big prize at the end. But what if you are one of the people you described that are sort of uncomfortable? They probably would never be able to bet $97,000 in a race, but they feel like they're pretty good, and they give prizes out for the top 25, and they would be happy to finish in the top 10, and they could do that with a total of $50,000. And so they're going to work backwards from that. Do you think that's still not fully leveraging your $2,500 entry fee, or is that a reasonable approach, or how would you respond to something
Both.
like that?
I'd say it's both. You are not fully leveraging your $2,500, but I don't think you're wasting it either. And to someone that says, look, these crazies at the top that are firing all their nutso money, I'm not going to deal with that, right? These top 2 or 3 people that are taking this risk, that's not me. But to your point, Chris, when you look at places 3 through, what does it pay? 15 spots maybe, but let's just say like 3 through 10. Those are great prizes. Those include NHC seats. They include lots of cash. Yes, I would say, you have to do the math for yourself to make sure you think you're getting your equity, you're getting your money's worth. But yeah, $2,500 to access the prize pool other than the tippy top, I still think is worth it. the person that I would really encourage to not do this is the person that sets a target of $20,000 for themselves or 15, right? First of all, if you take $7,500 and turn it into 20 or $15,000, nice job, period. That's not easy to do. It's a big deal. It's not going to get you anything in this tournament, and you will have wasted $2,500. And so I would say sell your entry and then just go play with some of the money and, pocket what you need to pocket and be as responsible as you feel you need to be, and recognize that the tournament's a bit out of your league financially, or you could make it in your league. Go pick up a partner, right? Actually, the best partners in the world for this kind of thing are brothers who don't follow horse racing, right? They're not going to bother you with their opinions. They're not going to tell you how to bet. They think you're good at this stuff. And you just need an investor that's not going to interfere. And so, okay, maybe if between you and your brother, you have an entry and he's wealthy, so you don't have to worry about, if he loses, he can handle it. Right now, are you comfortable, right, with the fact that it's only half yours? Now, can you get to the point where it's a little easier to shove 33 grand on Nick's Go because it's only 16 grand, but it's still your name when you win the whole tournament, and it's validation and it's all this great stuff, and it's still a lot of money. And by the way, if the BCBC was worth half of what it is, it's still a lot. And so I don't think the dilution is that severe, but right, that would be my encouragement to someone who is struggling with, I don't think I'm going to be capable of doing it based on the dollars. I can't responsibly wing it with a $10,000 entry like this. Well, again, maybe you have 9 high school buddies, and maybe they know that you're the horse racing guy. And right, your 9 buddies invest in you, and now you're only a tenth of it. Frankly, I'd find that a lot worse, because the idea of having 9 people look to me to win, I'd rather lose the money than lose the standing with friends or whatnot. But that's a different story. But maybe they come with, and you make it a team thing. There's nothing collusive or wrongful about 2 buddies walking up to the Breeders' Cup, buying an entry, a single entry in one of their names, and them talking the whole day about who they like, and the one going and betting that stuff. Right? You're not colluding. You're not using one entry to benefit another or somehow cheating the competition. You and your partner are talking about who you like. That's frankly how I got started with this. This was way too big for me, and I went with a friend, and we split it. And it was a terrific kind of first step. And okay, thankfully I kept stepping further in my own case. But there's lots of ways to approach it. But it's the annual Olympics of horse racing. It's the best time. And as much fun as that tournament is, and as much glory as it carries with it, right, I would still say sell the entry, play at a dollar amount that is responsible for you. And if you went to the Breeders' Cup weekend with you won a $10,000 entry, you sold it for the street value, depending who you asked, $9,000 or $9,500. And if you put $5 grand in your pocket and you played with $4 grand for the weekend and you hit a couple things, you'd be thrilled to death. And I would say that depending on the person, that may be the more responsible move. So like I said, responsible gaming is certainly no ADW put me up to putting that kind of crap in the book. I actually mean it. But as I look back at my own path to success, mental impediments were a huge part of it. Not feeling like, I'm not one of these expert handicappers. This can't be me. I'm not the kind of person that can win this. Go look and listen to the interviews given by most of the winners of these competitions. Most of us, hopefully, and I think it's true, are pretty humble and pretty quick to say, yeah, I didn't really think this was going to be me. I didn't really see this happening. I was such an average player for so long. So it is regular people that are winning these things, but it does require a certain getting into the zone and being a little different than your normal self. Speaking on that for a second, I find one of the hardest parts of the year coming home from the Breeders' Cup, because the units are all out of whack for me, and it takes me a while to kind of get back to regular. I don't play at these dollar amounts with this kind of regularity, firing with that kind of regularity. And I got to settle down after that. But at least for me, based on where I'm at, and admittedly, I've got the fortune of playing with some house money. Playing in this tournament every year is a given. And if it is a given, it gives you the ability to get the money part of it out of your head quickly and just get to focusing on what it's going to take to win.
Okay, so I want to kind of follow up on that with a way you start your book out. I think it was in the first chapter, one of the first ones. You talk about, how your strategy for playing 9-ball and how you kind of exploit the rules in an unorthodox way to give yourself an edge. And I think that kind of gambling mindset and approach, it's a great illustration of that. So I was wondering maybe if you kind of talk about that if you're willing. I don't know how much of the book you want to talk about, but that idea, because I thought it was a good one.
That's a great. So let's combine 9-ball with the concept of playing 2 entries, because that's going to give I think I can make a good connection there. The 9-ball story.
Okay, so great. Before you do that, just before, because there's some of the listeners may not be real familiar with contests. So in these contests, typically you can have up to 2 entries. Normally they limit you to 2. A few of the live bankroll might allow you to have a 3rd entry, but that's typically the max. In the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, you can actually have 2 entries. And that's what you're talking about. You could, so rather than just having 1 entry, which costs $10,000, you could have 2, which gives you 2, more money to play with. So I just want to make sure they understand what you mean before we get into that.
Perfect. And I'll keep going on that for a second and say, you can play your 2 entries for the most part how you want to. You can play them in the same race. You can play them in different races. It's up to you. And so going in double-barreled, you might approach it as, I have 2 completely independent chances to win this thing, or you might approach it a little differently like I do. But let's go back to 9-ball for a second. The quick story on 9-ball. It's a game where this isn't stripes and solids where you have to hit in all these balls and then hit in the 8. If you can legally hit it, whoever gets the 9-ball in first wins. And I'm not a great pool player, and found a good strategy for creating chaos on the table and sinking the 9-ball faster than most of my friends can sink it playing the right or proper way by hitting them all in order. And so, it's a true story. It's a really funny story, but it's a really good example of people looking at me saying, what do you mean you don't hit the balls in order? Like, it's allowed, but that's crazy. What kind of a strategy is that? Well, it's a strategy. I know that I can't beat those guys playing the quote unquote right way. And so I find a strategy to do something different. Well, okay, let's look, and it doesn't have to be the BCBC, but let's look at a live money tournament where you're allowed 2 entries. I would argue that someone taking those 2 entries and playing them with complete independence from one another is eliminating an awful lot of the power of those 2 entries. And again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, because I know this isn't necessarily intuitive or common thinking. I look at my approach in a tournament as a stair step. Right? I might need to hit, I know I need to hit the last race. How many do I need to hit before that is a function of the prices that my horse is paid, the target that I'm shooting for. In a typical Breeders' Cup, I probably need to hit 3 or 4 things on the same entry, by the way, typically. And so the question is, do you want to use those 2 entries as 2 independent ways to get there? Or do you essentially want to use one of them as a way to slingshot you well into the path that you're trying to go along? So I'll give a common example and say you find a race where there's just a cannot lose horse, in your opinion. maybe you watched Ways and Means this weekend and said, oh my gosh, this horse is taking a Breeders' Cup race down. I don't care if the horse is 4-5. This is my lock of the tournament. And you look at the race before or after, and you find a race where you just absolutely love 3 horses, and pretty much no one else is any good in your opinion. And so you've taken a 12-horse Breeders' Cup race and narrowed it to 3 horses. You look at the daily doubles with your lock of the weekend into these 3 horses, and you see really generous payoffs. For me, one entry, splitting the entry by betting smaller denomination units of those daily double bets in the one entry and leaving the other entry alone is absolute crazy town to me. If this is a high confidence spot, I'm taking these 2 entries and firing both of them at the same time in different directions. And if I'm right with my theory that, again, I don't really think I'd have to look at the Ways and Means race and how it shapes up. But if I'm right with my theory that Ways and Means wins, and if I can get one of these 3 horses home in the second race, I will have just blasted my entire bankroll, potentially, on 2 entries in these 2 different directions. One of them goes to 0, and one of them is, well on my way to my target number. And so for me, in the context of I don't know how much I do that in cash betting. You have to pay a lot more attention to return on investment and whatnot. But in the context of a tournament where the only point is to get up that leaderboard, this is an interesting slingshot approach to doing it, where, especially if, getting into the example further, maybe it's an all-in push on one combo on one entry, and because the other 2 are longer odds prices, maybe you're splitting the other entry amongst those 2. Or maybe it's 2 all-in entries, and you can bring in even more complicated concept, and you can bet the 3rd horse on the side. That's not, it's probably worth getting into that a little bit. It's way too big a stretch to say I'm famous for something, but I think I'm known in the tournament world for a willingness to integrate cash play into my tournament play. And by that, I mean, if I love 3 horses in the tournament, I might play only 2 of them, and I might play the 3rd on the side for huge, figuring, okay, if I get knocked out of the tournament, at least I'll get paid. This might be the only tournament of the year where I don't monkey around with that. The dollars are too big. You're never really in a position to know that you're hedging a win anyway. And so this is one where, my little cash betting strategies on the side, this isn't the place for that. Even everyone has their limits. And for me, I'm not sure I'd be able to do something like that. And so instead, I'm looking at my 2 entries. And I think in the book, I referenced the model of a fullback and a running back. And for me, starting the day, I don't know which one is the running back or which one is the fullback. But the idea is, hopefully, I can use one of these to help the other. And I'll give an example, and then we'll move on to another topic. 2021 Breeders' Cup, I'm sitting with a total of approximately 24 grand, desperate to get to about, let's call it 35 grand. These numbers are approximate, but that's the number I wanted to bet on Nick's Go. I think it was 33. And so I'm trying to think about how to make 12 grand. There's lots of different approaches to how you can go about doing that, win bets, exactas, whatever. For me, I found the race with Life is Good at 3-5. And at this point in the tournament, I had 2 entries. I had an entry with 20-something thousand, and I had an entry with 6,000. I took the prime, so it's clear at this point, the running back is the one with 20-something thousand. This is the one that has the far better chance. And so I slammed every one of those dollars into Life is Good to win. But with the other entry, I was at least able to give myself some air cover. right? I don't remember. Ginobili was one of the two horses. Maybe Silver State was the other. I was able to play some stuff with the other entry, knowing one of these two entries is going to be dead in 2 minutes. I know that for a fact. But if Life is Good wins, and that's the one that's supposed to win, I'm going to be sitting pretty with my target amount waiting for my final race. And so, I was good with doing what I did on my main entry, but that second entry would have saved my life. If Life is Good didn't do well and I ended up cashing some $4,000 win bet on Ginobili at 5-1, well, that's not great, but at least it didn't knock me out of the tournament, and I'm still in it with a total that's close to what I want to bet on the end. So again, lots and lots of ways to do it, and I'm not passing judgment on other people, but I think as I've just articulated, the way you deploy these two entries relative to each other, you can make some magic out of something as opposed to making it just two independent shots. And again, it's a function of what's your plan? What are your opinions? Do you think Life is Good is invincible, in which case you don't need to waste that second entry? Someone could have looked at me and said, whoa, what are you doing? Ginobili and Silver State have no chance. Save your second entry for the Classic, and you can bet like a backup $7,000 exacta with essential quality over Knicks Go, and that'll still get you. Right. That would have been an interesting thought. I still like what I did, but I would have, it's also probably cheating to give that level of advice to someone in the middle of a tournament, but right. That would have been an interesting thought where the question of when to use that second entry to protect yourself. And, what if I had more confidence in Life is Good and chose to wait to use that second entry for later? Turns out that year it wouldn't have mattered anyway. But there's plenty of years it absolutely could have made a difference. And so, I would highly encourage people, and it's perhaps a sign that you're in over your head. Two entries are a must. And I know people disagree. Some people are shaking their heads saying, this is where this guy just lost me. I do think they're a must. You are competing against very powerful people with two entries. That second entry gives them a huge advantage over someone with one. And personally, I don't like entering competitions at a disadvantage, knowing that other people have a far better chance than I do just by virtue of the position they've put themselves in. I'd much rather take two people at the tournament and say, you guys should be best friends, work out a process for picking horses, and you should combine your entries and play as one person. Don't collude, don't do anything illegal, but I'd rather have a 50% stake of two than a 100% stake of one. I think the odds of cashing and winning are dramatically higher with that second.
Yeah, I would agree that, especially in bankroll tournaments versus a mythical win place, which we're not going to talk about on this podcast, but in those contests, I think the second entry has kind of marginal value, but in a live betting contest
right.
like the BCBs, in fact, might even be counterproductive for some people mentally. But in the live bankroll, like you're describing, it's definitely you're starting with $15,000 instead of $7,500. So it doesn't take a math whiz to figure out that's a pretty good advantage, right?
Right, and again, depending on the kinds of spots you look for, some people look at a race where there's two behemoths going at each other and say, this is impossible. One of these two is going to win this, and how am I supposed to figure this out? Well, man, I can tell you right now, that's my whole strategy. For this year coming up, that's the spot I'm looking for, is the race where someone says it can only come down to two horses. Because I know, unless something more compelling comes along, that is a perfect opportunity to deploy your two entries in opposite directions. And if they're really, even money chances or whatever, right, you're going to double up on one entry and the other will, that's a fine result. At that point, you probably only need to hit one more thing before you make your big play out to hit your final target. So I get it. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But for me, finding a race that you can get locked up with just a couple horses is phenomenal. My approach typically is not to try to isolate some hidden long shot somewhere. I do that from time to time, but the bigger plays I'm making tend to be more, high confidence, lower prices, looking for lockup spots. Maybe that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, and when you have two entries, an easy Goer Sunday Silence race is kind of nice for you because you can unload on both and have high confidence. You'll end up, worst case maybe emptying out one bank roll and doubling the other, which is what you're really trying to get. You're trying to get one of your entries into position to win the contest, right?
Exactly. And so, it's funny, I wasn't really a player back then, but take that year as an example where this classic is coming down to two horses. I don't think someone would be crazy to play their two entries identically until the last race, right? So maybe you find your two or three spots during the weekend that you like and you want to lean into a few horses, but maybe you don't want to waste that fullback. If you've got the patience, oh my gosh, that would be unbelievable. Could you imagine someone on the leaderboard going into the last race with, $50,000 on two entries, and they can just bet $50,000 on each horse and feel like they've got, that would be unbelievable. But again, it's a question of patience and timing. And most of us are so desperate to get to that last race that we'd rather deploy the fullback earlier. That's certain, and that's emotional, and that's personality based. And I'll admit that does factor into the way I play. Strangely, when someone says at the start of the BCBC, "What's your goal?" Of course, I want to win, or I want one of my buddies to win, or whatever. But if you really if you really boil it down, I'd love to have a horse in the starting gate of the last race live to what I think could be a winning total. That's really my selfish answer, is that I want that feeling again. I want to get into the gate with a chance. And so it's with that goal that I'm looking at these two entries saying, how do I best give myself a chance to get to that starting gate? So for me, the odds of being able to patiently hold on to that second entry and just play it in mirror fashion to the first the whole time, I don't have that kind of patience. I'd love, boy, would that be an amazing feat to be able to do that. But at some point I would panic and feel a need to protect one of the entries earlier than that. But it's a question of when. There's times that I will do that right out of the starting gate where my first couple bets are huge and they go in two completely separate directions. Or it could be the Life is Good example where, if you're following the way I'm talking about this, it kind of happened at the second step of my operation rather than at the first step. But like I said, I don't know that I'm going to have the patience to hold it until the final step. It would be really impressive to do it, but I would almost need it to be flukish that I hit randomly on two entries with something that I was able to negotiate it that way. Odds are one of these will be laid down for the other.
Okay, that's good. I'd like to pause right here and call this part one of this podcast, and we'll get into part two in the next. But I'm going to put a pin on this right now. And thank you, Matt, for sharing your insights. We're going to pick up on this again in part two, which will be coming soon. But for now, I want to thank you, Matt, and also thank all the listeners out there for supporting Bet with the Best podcast. And may you all boldly go where no horse player has gone before.